Welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, a third night of anti-migrant protests in Thetford, Norfolk has forced asylum seekers to flee their homes. Controversial plans to build a data centre in Brick Lane have been approved. The Cambridge plagiarism scandal surrounding Jason Arday continues to dominate their headlines, and droughts are changing the face of England. I asked Adrienne why we're not seeing a climate movement at the moment in this country, or at least a strong, active climate movement. Where are they? I'm Michael Walker, and today I'm joined by Banseka. Kayembe, welcome back. You've just been for 2 weeks in Johannesburg, I believe.
Yeah, spent a long time in a new place. It's always great to go somewhere new because you get to see how things are done differently. They've got an interesting constitutional settlement there. They've got 3 capital cities, which is really, really interesting. And it's also interesting, of course, to go there and contend with the history of South Africa. They've got some very interesting racial classifications over there that were very interesting to grapple with, and a lot of anti-migrant sentiment as well, which of course feels similar to home, unfortunately, as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you think we've got anti-migrant protests, they're bigger in South Africa, right?
I would say, yeah.
A lot bigger. We'll get to that in a moment. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. You can also listen to the show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Please do like this video, subscribe to the channel, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Strawberries and cream, warm beer in the park, and now race riots. These are all things associated with British summers. And last night, Thetford in Norfolk saw its third night of violent anti-migrant protests, with asylum seekers forced to flee their homes. Since Tuesday night, demonstrators have been gathering in areas of the market town where they believe asylum seekers are housed, which has led to confrontations with police. The protests appear to have been triggered by the publication of a list of purported addresses of asylum seekers online. According to police, windows have been smashed, homes have been smeared with eggs, and some protesters have attempted to break into them. Others have chanted, "We want them out." On Thursday night, the police say asylum seekers were removed from some properties in the town for their own safety. Police say 2 of their officers were taken to hospital following clashes on Wednesday night. One of them, a policewoman, was badly bitten. That's according to the force. So far, 5 arrests have been made, and police have been given additional powers to deal with any further actions. But police have also been accused by the protesters of being heavy-handed. Norfolk Police Constable Paul Sanford addressed those claims on Sky News.
There have been criticisms of your police force that you've been heavy-handed. Reports, I don't know whether it's true, that pepper spray has been used, for example, on a woman in a mobility scooter. What is your response to those criticisms?
My officers acted with the utmost professionalism throughout the three nights of difficulties that we've had. I've heard about the reports of the lady being contaminated with the pepper spray. If there is an active protest taking place where officers are facing hostile actions from members of the public, and the wider public ignore our pleas to stand back, to move away from the area, then they place themselves at risk. And that's what happened here.
So where have these protests come from? Well, back in June, it emerged that the Home Office planned to use the nearby RAF Barnum base as an asylum seeker accommodation centre, which would house up to 3,750 people if approved. Barnum is a small Suffolk village of around 600 residents. And some of those residents actually didn't seem to mind this idea. So this is from the East Anglia Times reporting at the time. So they said, on the streets of Barnum, those who spoke to this paper said they saw no concern or problems with the proposal. Sid Bullock said the majority of asylum seekers were no trouble. He added, not a problem with it, not really. Emma Moss said, I'm impartial. If people need help, then we should give it to them. The location has good links to Thetford and the village is quite diverse anyway. Another local who wished to remain anonymous said, I have no objection to it. Anyone who comes here seeking support, it should be the British way to help them. No concern whatsoever. I feel sorry for the refugees because it's a bit out of the way and the gates are right on a busy road. Those are perspectives you don't normally hear from people who are about to have a bunch of asylum seekers sort of housed in their local area. Obviously, the noisiest people are the people who go on demonstrations. Maybe that's the silent majority. I'm not sure. It's not very scientific. having a journalist going out and speaking to some people in the street, but interesting nonetheless. Things appeared different in any case in Thetford, the nearest town to Barnham, but across the border in Norfolk. And feelings were so high there that in early July, local Thetford residents besieged a town council meeting to discuss the issue. Security guards and police were called. Now, around the same time, West Suffolk County Council unanimously voted to oppose the Home Office's plans. However, late last month, the Home Office submitted an urgent application to use the RAF base, meaning the Home Secretary could overrule the Council's decision. Labour MP Terry Jeremy, who represents Thetford's constituency, appeared on BBC Breakfast this morning.
I know RAF Barnham really well. I've lived in Thetford all my life. My family have lived here for generations. I know Barnham. It's not appropriate for the use that's being proposed. We are a very rural location, very limited infrastructure, very limited public services. And I've been working cross-party with lots of different politicians, councils, to be clear to the government why Barnham's not acceptable. And I've been talking to local residents about their concerns and addressing that. And that's why it's so frustrating to see the violence that we've had. They are scaring and terrifying people that live in Thetford, particularly people from minority ethnic communities who are contacting me terrified that they're going to be misidentified as an asylum seeker and attacked. I mean, we've had mixed race children being asked by other children if they are asylum seekers or immigrants. We've got to draw a line. We can have a debate about immigration. We can have a debate about how we process asylum seekers, but there needs to be some rules of engagement and basic respect for humanity as part of this.
Other politicians took a different line. Colin Sutton is Reform UK's National Policing and Crime Advisor. Earlier this year, he was elected as Norfolk Police and Crime Commissioner. He appeared on Newsnight last night alongside MP Terry Jeremy.
I don't know what people in the government actually expect. If you put these illegal immigrants into houses in the middle of housing estates, close to schools, next door to people, into communities who have absolutely no say in it, then I think it's a pretty reasonable expectation that the people there will not be happy about it and will want to make a fuss. The fact is that we're getting about 1,000 a week of these people coming in small boats, and we're running out of places to put them.
Terry, let's hear from Terry.
I think politicians like Colin Sutton and others should be absolutely clear in their condemnation of what's happened. We've seen vulnerable people targeted, literally pulled from their houses. Local residents in Thetford residents, particularly those of minority ethnic communities, living in fear at the moment that they are going to be misidentified as asylum seekers. We've seen female police officers bitten, others attacked. We should be clear that I am proud to be British, but my British values mean that I respect the rule of law, and we've not seen that. And as a police commissioner for Norfolk, Colin Sutton and others should be very clear about their condemnation.
Colin?
I condemn the violence, as I said earlier on. I do not condemn the protests. I think everybody has the right to make a peaceful protest. I understand the protests that are going on in Thetford. I understand why the people in Thetford are cross, why they're scared, and why they want to get onto the streets and show that protest. There have been protests at RAF Barnham virtually every Sunday since the announcement was made, and they have been peaceful protests involving the whole community from Thetford.
Banseka, I mean, in a way, we haven't seen sort of riots as bad as we did last year or the year before. This continues to be the sort of most divisive issue in the country, though, is when asylum seekers are housed in a local community that doesn't want them. Or at least, I don't want to say doesn't want them, actually, that's probably too, or at least their representatives don't want them, actually, because the council has voted to say we don't want these asylum seekers to be placed here. And then, obviously, that's in no way an excuse for violence. I mean, he said the protest is fine as long as there's not violence. I think any protest targeted at where people live is unacceptable, basically. If you want to protest at the town hall, or I suppose if the RAF base, I don't think the migrants are there yet, right? So if they want to protest at an empty RAF base, fine. But if they're protesting outside the houses where they believe asylum seekers live, whether or not you're violent, that's an incredibly intimidating act.
Yeah, absolutely. And it feels it's really ugly stuff. So some of the rhetoric that was sort of reported as having been heard on this protest were shouting things that were heavily racialized as well. Things like they don't want the white man anymore. We're being replaced. They want to swamp us. So the lines are seriously, seriously blurred. Perhaps year on year now, we're seeing things maybe not escalate or get as bad as you said, maybe we've seen it in past summers, but we're seeing this continuous load of protests against asylum seekers, which is blurring the lines more and more between race and migration and migrants. That is incredibly uncomfortable. I said at the start of the show that in South Africa, where I was in Johannesburg, there was a very visceral, palpable sense of anti-migrant sentiment, which has got quite serious. When we were driving at like 7 a.m. in the morning, there were people ready to protest. There were people ready on a Saturday morning to protest, and they're going to migrant areas, for example, and hounding people. There were migrants who, in particular areas, would not go out in the day in South Africa, and it felt like a glimpse into where we might be headed. Actually, it's really quite scary and quite unnerving. I think it's really interesting as well that social media is part of the story again. We seem to keep getting these kind of minor crises that happen where you get a flurry of activity that seems to be caused by misinformation or deliberate misinformation, perhaps on social media, or perhaps coordinated via social media.
There's not evidence this was based on misinformation, is there? I don't know enough.
No.
Is there?
I think it was coordinated via social media, yeah. So it's interesting to me how much, because for a long time we used to talk about how, well, social media, that's that thing happening over there.
Yeah.
It's not great, but, in the real world, blah, blah, blah. Well, actually, it seems to be having quite a tangible effect in the real world, in that it's allowing a space for people to organise, either based on misinformation or not, to then bring about some quite contentious and difficult things in real life that we're having to deal with, I think, now, and we're having to see and engage with, and that, unfortunately, migrants and anyone who could be believed to be a migrant, the MP, the Labour MP there was talking about mixed race kids, for example, being asked, if they were migrants and things like that. It's bad.
Well, South Africa's situation is actually, it's often sort of posted online by people on the right to sort of say, look, hostility to migrants isn't racism because black people in South Africa are also against immigration. I don't know I know I'm not sort of expecting you to be an expert on the politics of immigration in South Africa because you've just come back from there on a 2-week holiday. But I mean, from the extent to which you understand, what is the racial politics of anti-migrant protests in South Africa?
It's heavily racialized, and it's heavily racialized against particularly Black African migrants, I would say.
But who are on the protests? Black Africans as well?
Black South Africans.
Black South Africans.
So people from, say, Zulu heritage, for example. And it's been really interesting. Zulu culture is beautiful, but I think it is also being weaponized a lot by political actors in South Africa. It's quite a strong sort of culture, and it's being weaponized in a way that pertains to sort of nativist or very nationalist ideas. So it's being taken and it's being used and weaponized against African migrants who are coming from poorer countries, Congo in particular, where, the ire is being reserved largely for those Black African migrants more than anybody else, including other migrants of other colours, or including, I would say, like Western migrants there like me. They're not, I would be in danger there, but I don't think they're targeting people like me. I think they're targeting very specific demographics, and it's highly racialized, of course, which is deeply sad when we contend, obviously, with the history of South Africa and the apartheid years and the hope that came post-apartheid about what might follow. And then they seem to still find themselves in this kind of desperately difficult place around race and class. That's really something to behold, really. It was quite eye-opening going there.
Very interesting. I mean, I say we'll come back to this story, but hopefully we won't come back to this story because obviously there isn't, any more rioting or protests. I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about asylum seekers and small boats and where people are housed again, but hopefully it won't be the case that there are a bunch more riots throughout August. Very possible.
It's going to keep rumbling, I think.
But let's hope we're not speaking about this again in the next few days. The government has this week overruled local campaigners as well as a borough council to greenlight a new development in the heart of London's East End. If this were just loads of housing, I might say, great, stick it to the NIMBYs. Brilliant. Government overriding people trying to stop building homes that are desperately needed. However, slightly different here. Part of this development will be used to house not people, but a 5,000 square metre data centre that could use the same amount of energy as 15,000 homes. The Truman Brewery site is, as the name suggests, an old brewery on Brick Lane. And once the home of London's largest brewer, the 10-acre estate was abandoned after it shut down in 1989. In 1995, it was bought by Baghdad-born businessman Eli Zalouf for a reported £10 million. He'd migrated to Brick Lane in the 1970s, where he built up a garment trade empire, now run by his three sons, but owned by several offshore entities. They redeveloped it into a complex of galleries, independent shops, and event spaces. I've had many a beer in a plastic cup there, I think. Besides the giant data centre, the £500 million redevelopment plan also includes 5 new buildings intended to house offices, shops and restaurants, a cinema and a market. And 44 new homes have been included in the design, with 11 classed as affordable, 6 for social rent. So not a huge persuasive offer to the local community. We'll give you this massive data centre and 6 social homes. Maybe the people of East London have been begging for a data centre. Maybe this is what all the people of Tower Hamlets are desperate to bring to their borough. Well, it's not, as you'd imagine. In July last year, Tower Hamlets Council rejected the redevelopment proposal, but the Truman Estates appealed to the Planning Inspectorate. And in October last year, Housing Secretary Steve Reed stepped in, saying the ultimate decision would be made by the national government. In the interim, Tower Hamlets created its own community master plan, suggesting that the site could be used to build 350 much-needed new homes and 44 for social rent. But last week, new Housing Secretary Angela Rayner dismissed those ideas and waved through the data centre proposals, and partly on the grounds that it would make financial transactions in the nearby city microseconds faster. In a letter, Rayner's department said the public benefit of that decrease in transaction time would be very significant indeed. You might wonder for who. Tower Hamlets Mayor Lutfi Rahman said this in response to the decision. I am deeply disappointed by the government's intervention to approve a development on Brick Lane despite objections from 7,000 people and Tower Hamlets Council rejecting the application, which includes a proposed data centre. It is a scandal that this will only deliver 6 homes for social rent in one of the most overcrowded and densely populated places in the country, while thousands of families languish on housing waiting lists and a staggering 1 in 21 children in London are homeless. We will never get back this missed opportunity to deliver the social and affordable housing Tower Hamlets residents urgently need. Local campaigners gave their views on the decision to the BBC last week.
The decision is obviously deeply disappointing to us. The local authority were fully supportive of our campaign. No one in the local authority wanted this to go through. It was taken out of their hands, taken out of our hands, and has become a decision at national government level. We find it quite extraordinary that they have approved a huge amount of office spaces and, of all things, a data centre, when the local plan shows that we could see a delivery of 350 homes on this site. In the borough which has the most overcrowded housing situation in the country, and the highest projected population growth in the country, to come up with a data centre here is shocking.
And so if you have very strong views about this as well.
Yeah, Brick Lane's an iconic place. It's somewhere that we socialise in. It's a step up for the working class communities and the ethnic minorities here into the city. And it's a place that's always been community scale. So to suddenly put loads of offices here is wholly inappropriate. And also they've taken us through all of these consultation processes. And now they're saying they're only going to allow 6 homes. And they say the site can hold hundreds of homes. And we need to alleviate the poverty that's been historic here, but also we experience that on a daily basis. Our communities are really feeling the cumulative impact of some of these issues which are not being alleviated by the planning system.
Now, as someone who knows the area, it's a very strange place on the face of it to build a data centre. So the brewery obviously hasn't been a brewery for a while, but it's very well used. There's always a market in there. It's always super busy around there. I think of it as sort of a very sort of central London cultural space. It's not a sort of out-of-town industrial park, which is where I sort of imagine data centres should be built. Now, or should be built if they're going to be built, let's say. I'll leave that open. So why they're doing it here is because people in the city want to have information and make trades in sort of microseconds. And this is called high frequency trading. And it is, if there ever was sort of something that they do in the city which is completely pointless and has no social utility, it's this. Because the whole point is you want to make a trade a millisecond before some other trader in a different city or in a different building. And that millisecond is going to make the difference between if you make money or lose it. Now, the whole argument for having, a private banking system is to say that these private sector organizations are going to be able to judge which projects are going to be most profitable, which projects are going to be successful. They put money where it's needed to make successful businesses or successful investments. Now, there is no business which will be successful if you give it funding a millisecond sooner than someone else. So I would say if you need the data center that close, obviously the City of London right next to Brick Lane, if you needed that context, if your investment decisions are based on the millisecond, I would suggest what you're doing is socially pointless, which would be my argument against the data centre. Of course, Brick Lane isn't the only community being impacted by Westminster's commitment to the data centre build-out. The Labour government is keen to make London the leading AI hub in Europe. And Potter's Bar in North London could see itself transformed with 85 acres of greenbelt land soon to be handed over to become one of the largest data centre developments in Europe. Again, with my YIMBY hat on, I'm often saying, we've got a lot of green space. I think we could afford some houses on them. I'm not so sure when it comes to a big, massive data centre. If that is, I'd probably prefer the field in that case. Residents in Potter's Bar are fighting back, as well as in Buckinghamshire, Devon, South Wales, Norfolk and Scotland. These are all the places where there is a movement against data centre construction. And in London alone, there are already 192 data centres either already operating or under development, with more in the neighbouring counties. Now, obviously, they all take up space, but that's not the only factor that puts them in competition with housing. This is from the Financial Times. Data centre electricity demand in Great Britain was estimated at 7.6 terawatt hours in 2025. That's according to the National Energy System Operator, and could rise nearly tenfold to 71 terawatt hours by 2050. Now, as reported in the FT earlier this week, the 24 planned hyperscale data centre developments in Scotland would require 1.5 times Scotland's peak electricity demand. That's what campaigners say, right? And then the quote, there's basically not the capacity within the electricity network to sustain data centres, which clearly are very energy hungry, and new housing developments as well. So that's from Steve Turner, Executive Director of the Home Builders Federation in the UK. So this is energy competing with houses. And I know that sort of lots of housing developments are being held up because they say, well, there isn't enough energy for these homes to sort of have secure energy and for there not to be potential sort of blackouts when the energy supply is low. But there is enough for the data centres. Again, doesn't seem quite right. Of course, until our grid is fully green, all that electricity demand means more emissions. The data centres also require water for cooling, or at least most of them do. So last month, Water UK warned that the government's water forecasts failed to include the millions upon millions of litres likely to be consumed by data centres, and they accused the Environment Agency of ignoring that consumption in its national framework for water resources. Banseka, have you ever been to the Truman Brewery?
I have not, no.
Well, you probably never will, unless you're on a tour of a data centre or you're lucky enough to get one of those 44 homes. What do you make of this story? Labour coming in, the local council don't want it. They're saying, I presume they're saying this is strategically important, or it's going to, we'd be foregoing so much profit if we didn't build it, that we've got to do it. We've got to override those local concerns. Because they get lots of tax revenue from the City of London.
London feels like it's just becoming unlivable. More and more, there's more reasons, isn't there, to just feel like you cannot really live here. There's a bit of a contradiction, I think, coming through with Labour and the way Andy Burnham's positioned the Labour government, which is that it's meant to be about returning power back to sort of local communities, which I completely agree with, by the way. I really don't want all decisions to be made in Whitehall by any means at all. But, it does seem like maybe that's only true of certain areas. So it's okay with London, which still has local areas. It's a collection to me of many small communities kind of stitched together. That's how I think of London, right? I think Londoners also have a right to be able to have a say at a local level. And we have to also respect the locality of our local representatives who also have inside local knowledge about what may or may not be best for a particular area. So there is this kind of strange contradiction, I think, or inconsistency between some of the rhetoric that Andy Burnham has kind of set out his premiership with and perhaps what's happening in reality. I think it's very curious as well that sort of Angela Rayner, who's our housing secretary, to be saying, well, it's worth foregoing, more available housing so that a hedge fund manager could do his job a fraction of a second faster. That doesn't feel very convincing.
Well, they will say, so there is, as I say, it's a completely pointless industry. If you're making trades by the millisecond, you're sort of arbitraging and you're trying to sort of see little gaps where you can sort of make this opportunity by doing it quicker than anyone else. Now, I think that's socially useless on a macro scale. I assume what the Labour government would argue is that this is going to happen somewhere, and if we don't give the City of London the fastest access to data centres, I mean, this used to sort of be a lot to do with sort of the fastest access to the internet as well, but now this new frontier is the data centres, then this pointless industry will go to a different city and then they'll get the tax revenue. So we want to get the rents from this pointless industry, and to do that, we need to forego some housing to build this data centre in like a culturally iconic location. You can see I'm not particularly convinced by this argument, but that's what they would say.
And it feels incoherent because I also don't understand the plan to redistribute that money that is generated by that industry. Like, okay, but who benefits? Like, who gets that money? Of course, I'm not against like wealth creation and wealth generation, but who gets to profit from that? Will the local residents see something back from that, or will it all go into the pockets of shareholders and the wealthy? So that there's an incoherency, I think, to that, unfortunately, which I'm not really buying. And London is also, I will say, I'm in a bit of a London victim mentality at the moment. We're also at the forefront of these heat waves. We're kind of suffering the most with the heat waves. It's really kind of bearing down on London. And again, this is it's an odd juxtaposition to be talking about data centres. Yeah, it's going to be great for London at a time when we are going through a kind of unbearable series of heat waves, which in part are being made worse, of course, by the environmental damage of the likes of data centres as well. So there's some inconsistencies there. And I think that Andy Burnham's government, it feels to me, is shaping up to be quite weak on some of these areas, particularly around, climate and links to climate as well. There's a very clear through line, I think, for the likes of Zach Polanski to just kind of go ham on some of this stuff from a green perspective, right? And from an environmental perspective, because we are really feeling the material impacts right now of climate change. We are living through it right now. And so this does feel like an area of weakness or kind of poor long-term vision maybe from Burnham that's emerging. I don't know if you also saw, just a quick final point, that Andy Burnham has scrapped net zero targets in terms of government procurement. So if you're looking for a supplier in government, you don't have to try and do anything apparently now to ensure that they're meeting a net zero target. So there's some directions here which to me are not very good and not very smart long term.
Yeah, on the point about local democracy, I have very mixed feelings.
Okay.
Because I do think that giving all the power to people within a borough about what can be built in that borough has some negative consequences. And the biggest example of that was this week. I don't know if you saw this story, where Westminster Council, the Conservative Council of Westminster, so there's a very active residents group in Soho who live in Soho but are really annoyed that it's noisy. If you're not from London or the UK, Soho is the nightlife capital of London, of the country, essentially, right? But there are lots of people who live there who campaign against sort of new bars opening or sort of outdoor dining, all sorts of stuff. And this new document from the Tory local council has said that they won't allow any new clubs, any new pubs, any new sort of license for a new entertainment venue, because they said there's already too much. They called it like the cumulative impact policy or something like that, because there's already so many pubs we can't possibly have any more. And this is the clincher. They're going to encourage all pubs to only allow sitting down. So there's not going to be, I think, what they call vertical drinking, because that encourages people to sort of crowd around and converse. And they want to encourage all pubs and bars in Soho to be table service, essentially. And obviously, if you live in Soho, I can see why that might be, something that you believe in. And most of the people who go and have a good night out in Soho don't live in Westminster. They live in London's other boroughs, or they're visiting. And so I do think that it's not necessarily quite right to have Westminster Council decide what pubs and bars can be open in Westminster and how drinks can be served. And I mean, you can make a similar argument about, now I happen not to think that we should have a data centre on Brick Lane, but with lots of key infrastructure, no council's going to want it. If this were about sort of pylons, I'd probably be more in favour of the, you know, if I thought that this was socially useful, I'd be like, yes, government, come in here and build the thing because I want to get more stuff built. So I feel like to be consistent, I have to not be outraged on the local democracy front here. But I just think the government have made the wrong call because we don't need a data centre in Brick Lane. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair enough. Like, I think ultimately you don't want power concentrated too much anywhere. So ultimately we also don't want to just give total ultimate power to local leaders themselves either, right? And one of the contentions that I've had with Andy Burnham's whole concept about devolution and about giving more power to local mayors is, well, in what ways do we not know that they will also still replicate a lot of the same issues and problems happening within those spaces and those boroughs anyway? So it's we have to think of it as something more fluid and as a kind of constant dialogue and back and forth, rather than a kind of carte blanche rule of like, well, this is a local issue, so the local people or our local representatives get to decide, end of story. There probably needs to be some more fluidity, I think, there.
I actually think the Metro Mayor is the right size, right? Because I think national government, too big, local councils, too small, because when it's that small, it just really encourages NIMBYism, because the people in that particular local area, the jobs don't really matter to them because they can work in the borough next door. What really matters is like peace and quiet or whatever. Whereas I think if you're the whole of London or the whole of Greater London, you can make the strategic decision. Do we want a data centre in central London? Yes, well, it's going to have to go somewhere. No, well, let's not build it. Do we want like really dense housing in the centre of London? Yes, well, even if this council doesn't want it, we're building it, I'm sorry. Should we have a nightlife district where pubs can be open past 11 p.m. and people can make a noise on the weekend, right? Yes, it's going to be in Soho. If you don't like it, you're going to have to live somewhere else. So I think I would give the Mayor of London much more power, Mayor of Greater Manchester much more power. That to me, in most instances, is the right unit.
I mean, I get the impression Sadiq Khan is broadly in favour of data centres in London. I don't know if he's in favour of this specific data centre situation in Brick Lane, but I get the impression he seems quite happy about them being built in London from an economic perspective.
Well, he'd be really interested in the competitiveness of the city. Like, I think if there are people in the City of London telling him, if this data centre doesn't get built, we're going to go to Amsterdam or Dubai, I don't know what the big competitors are to London at the moment, then I imagine he will be quite sort of responsive to that. He is saying that he's going to overrule Westminster, or try to overrule Westminster Council.
Okay, on the Soho
when it comes
front.
to being able to drink a pint standing up.
Small wins.
So small wins, that's good. In the media, August in Britain is known as silly season. The reason? Parliament is in recess. There's less obvious news to report on, less political debates. And so more niche stories have to fill the gap, and they take on added significance. Now, unfortunately, for him at least, the story this week in silly season has been that of Jason Arday. Now, Arday, as I imagine you've all heard by now, was a Cambridge academic in a prestigious role as Professor of Education. When he was appointed, he was celebrated as the youngest black professor in the university's history. But after extensive allegations of plagiarism, fabrication of data, and invented backstories, which all emerged sort of over the past fortnight, Arday has resigned. Now, the controversy is deeply embarrassing for Arday and for Cambridge University. But how newsworthy is it? Academic appointments at UK universities, even when they go horribly wrong, wouldn't usually make the inside of a national newspaper, let alone a front page. But this week, this story has been inescapable. On Thursday, Arday's resignation was the main story on the front page of The Telegraph. It was also on the front of The Times and The Guardian. The Daily Mail declared in glee that the scandal the left dismissed as racism had led to Arday stepping down from his job. It was also the top story on the BBC today for a while. The reference to the left dismissing concerns about Arday, sort of that you saw on the front page of the Mail there, that was in part a reference to a letter organised by the Good Law Project, which was signed by academics, politicians and other public figures, perhaps most notably Zach Polanski. Now, this was the video the Good Law Project shared to promote that letter.
You might have not heard who Jason Arday is. Jason is the youngest black professor in Cambridge's history, and to the surprise of literally no one, from the start, newspapers like The Telegraph and The Times have been calling him a diversity poster boy and just overall annoying him. But now they're taking it a step further and they're trying to smear him with accusations of plagiarism, basically saying his work isn't his own and trying to discredit him. And it's really interesting because it doesn't matter that academic journals universities. Everybody that has looked into these claims has found no evidence of plagiarism whatsoever. The newspapers do not care. And we have to talk about it. A baseless smear campaign against a distinguished Black academic isn't just a personal attack. It's an attempt to shut down a Black person who has a platform.
Now that video, which has now been viewed sort of over 2 million times on social media, has aged very badly. In fact, that's why it's been viewed so many times, because so many people are sharing it, saying this has aged badly. The reason it's aged badly is because we've all seen it now, there was a considerable overlap between Arday's work and that of others. There is also evidence of quotes from interviewees in his papers being either fabricated, we don't really know, or mislabeled. There's clearly some inconsistencies there, which sort of really puts into question the method used. And most famously, Arday's backstory, from running marathons with a broken leg to receiving pig heads in the post, have seemingly fallen apart under scrutiny. And The Atlantic this week also had another damning piece comparing the unlikely events in his memoir, set to be released next week in the US, to the proposal he wrote for that memoir. And there are sort of some inconsistencies. So they say the proposal also lays out many of the same events as the memoir, but with slightly different dates and details. The boys who beat him up were not his age, but 4 years older. His suicide attempt happened before, not during the pandemic. And whereas the book describes Arday as having survived 2 brain tumours, the proposal says he had a bout of testicular cancer. No reference to that illness appears in the memoir. Nor does the book describe the time that Arday, then a teenager, was struck by a car and spent several months in a coma. According to the book proposal, the doctors told his parents that he would never recover and suggested taking him off life support as an act of mercy. Through all of this, he was aware of everything that was going on because he had locked-in syndrome. As I will describe to readers in the book, Arday wrote in the proposal, "These months afforded me another profoundly different way of perceiving the world." They write, the book doesn't describe any of this, nor that he awakened miraculously from the coma, nor the full year he spent relearning everything, how to walk, to talk. Instead, the memoir tells us only that he spent those months finishing his final year of secondary school and taking his exams. I was relieved, beyond relieved, the memoir says, when those were done. And the inconsistencies go on and on and on. Now, obviously, in a book proposal, if it's a bit different to the finished product, that's fine. If it's a work of fiction, you might sort of change the stories to make it fit together nicer. Obviously, also, you might emphasize different things in the final addition to the proposal. But if you've got just huge, incredibly noteworthy events just appearing in one but not the other, it raises questions, clear inconsistencies, and they do go on and on if you go and read that article in The Atlantic. Now, when Arday was first appointed as a Cambridge professor, it was his unlikely backstory that led to him being so celebrated. So that's why the backstory is relevant. It's not just a sort of side note. He had numerous puff pieces written about him and even guest edited an edition of the BBC Today programme. So it's no wonder that the collapse of this story has elicited fascination, right? It's not a surprise that people find this interesting, especially as there's sort of so many developments. It has also, though, led to a frenzy on the right, which sees Arday as ultimate proof of the folly of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the attempt to make elite institutions more representative of society at large. It's an unfortunate situation, to say the least, and a group of Cambridge academics think their university is to blame. So their letter, which made the front page of The Guardian on Friday, accused Cambridge of unleashing grotesque racism by the manner in which it appointed Arday. So the group of Cambridge Dons are calling for an independent inquiry into Arday's appointment. And a professor of post-colonial studies, Priya Gopal, who is one of those organising the letter, told The Guardian this: "An independent investigation must scrutinise how such an early career appointment to a very senior and prestigious professorial chair was made, and what both the Faculty of Education and University Management have got very badly wrong. Whatever the results of any investigation, the university bears no little responsibility for the grotesque racism which this whole business has unleashed, and for the harm done both to the individual in the line of fire, to Black academics as a group, and the broader field of critical race studies. This requires accountability now from those responsible, not a cover-up." So this letter, I suppose, is written by people very much on the left, I think, or sort of who would define themselves as progressives, who are saying that because they promoted someone who seems questionable and potentially underqualified, that's now putting their discipline and confidence in other Black academics in doubt, especially among those who have sort of been banging this drum for a while. What's your thoughts on this story, I suppose, in general, Banseka?
It's a really sad situation, I think, and quite an ugly situation all round, really. You know, I can remember first hearing about Jason Arday several years ago. I didn't really look into him massively, but I knew he had this kind of very compelling, quite amazing, fantastical story. Obviously, now it turns out it was, a bit too fantastical, right? That there are some glaring inconsistencies. And I think that Guardian piece on Monday was the thing that finally, when I locked in and read that, I was like, okay, there's actually lots of things here that do not make sense. I think we've seen just time and time again, this is on replay now, whether it's the murder of Henry Novak, whether it's the attempted murder that was in Belfast, whether it was what was going on with migrants in the Moroccan-Spain border last week. We've seen that the right is really able to do this thing where it takes a single story, it takes a singular moment and then spins a whole story out of it that actually feels quite coherent. I think there is a section of people who are going to look at this story that's now being spun out of this particular incident and thinking, well, damn, maybe Black academics are being over-promoted over white people. This is another example, perhaps, of the ways in which the tables are turning, and we've gone too far. It's DEI gone mad, as the right often like to frame it. If we pull out and look at the bigger picture, of course, we know that there's actually quite a lot of systemic issues against Black academics in the field. They hold under 1% of professor roles, despite making up about 4% of the population. So they're underrepresented, actually. But these singular stories, these singular moments that the right are very adept, at latching onto and then kind of spinning a whole story out of, they're very, very good at doing that. And that leaves, I think rightly, as Priya has put in that letter, her and her colleagues, it leaves, Black academics vulnerable. There are now other Black academics who are being questioned without any real basis, as far as I can see. The likes of, the popular historian David Olusoga, for example, is now being questioned online about his credibility. As far as I know, that no one's brought any evidence to suggest that David Olusoga is not qualified to do the things that he's doing. So there's this very tangible material impact that is coming out of this, which I think is incredibly worrying. Me and you have had conversations, I think, before about DEI and a kind of leftist critique of DEI, which I think is missing. I think sometimes there are people maybe on the left who are a bit too scared to bring a critique of diversity initiatives that is actually really, really needed. And in that vacuum, there was a very good piece by Jason Arday that we were talking about earlier, and he really kind of laid out a view which I completely agree with as well, which is that in that vacuum, where the left refuses to have an alternative to these kind of liberal DEI solutions, which deep down many Black and brown people know are quite empty and are for show and are for ticking a box, they're not really about levelling the playing field. In that vacuum, the right comes out to play, and it plays hard.
But I suppose the reason it's playing hard here, I don't know, lots of them believe very unpleasant things, but is because their critique was always that the attempt to diversify elite institutions is going to lead to unqualified people hired because of their identity. And in this situation, it does seem like an unqualified person was hired because of his identity. So I suppose, does one need to say, okay, some of the things you were saying, you had a point? Or, I mean, how would you respond?
Well, I think it's about saying, looking at these diversity initiatives and thinking about, I suppose, what the end goal was here. Because I think part of him is not just that he's hired because he's Black. I suppose they could have pulled anybody off the street in that case. They could have hired me. But they hire him as well, in part because of this kind of fantastical narrative and story that he had, right, that really kind of captured headlines. Really kind of made for a great grand story that I think really allowed the institution to be able to say, look at us, we're doing, diversity, we're better, we're getting better with our representation, we're ticking those kinds of boxes. And of course they weren't. It's just window dressing. There's actually, I think, at the heart of some of this endeavor to do these kind of tick box exercises, to me, it's an outgrowth of individualism. I'm saying, here's this one individual, this fantastic Black excellence, larger-than-life individual who's got this fantastic story, never mind the fact that he doesn't perhaps seem to actually be maybe very adept at the job itself. Let's raise him up and put him on a platform rather than actually looking at how we make equality better across the board for everybody. And there's lots of issues in academia, not just with race, with class, with gender, loads of stuff.
Let's look at a clip, because we do have some insight into his hiring. Because the BBC reported on it at the time. It was a very celebratory story. Isn't this brilliant? This was the head of Arday's department speaking in 2023.
We've listened to the voices of our Black scholars and our Black students, and some of it has not been easy to hear, to be honest, but we're able to face up to some of the structural issues that people face.
There will be those that think this is a tokenistic appointment. What are your thoughts on this?
The Board of Electors on your interview day were absolutely unanimous. We are so lucky to have you. You are the best in the world in terms of the research that you do.
Now, I mean, beyond the plagiarism allegations, the sort of, was there, I suppose, academic fraud in terms of sort of some of the interviewees in the, you know, his is qualitative research. So your interviewees are actually sort of the key data point you're using, and some of them are inconsistent. So sort of the same quote being used by people with different characteristics, and it doesn't add up. And then you've got the fantastical background. So, you know, Cambridge could plausibly claim that this was all information which arose later on. I mean, they did actually also shut down anyone asking any questions. Carter Ruck, who are a very sort of powerful law firm, were hired. I don't know if that was by him or the university or someone else, but that sort of shut down one bit of reporting. Obviously, the police were called on one other journalist, and they investigated him for a little while, which was ridiculous. So there were a lot of opportunities for, I mean, what looks like the truth to come out. But putting all of that aside, I know you were saying you were listening to a sort of podcast with this guy earlier. I was watching a lecture with this guy earlier. If he was ever considered the best in the world in this discipline, the discipline has a problem. Yeah. Because I watched, you know, half of a 40-minute lecture, and it was just word salad and nothing was said. It felt like I was in a kind of HR talk where someone was just phoning it in.
Yeah, sort of buzzwordy almost.
Buzzwordy. And so and also I think that lady, she's the head of faculty. She is sort of another professor of education. She sort of does, I think, kind of like peace and conflict in education, something that sounds very wishy-washy. Like I think she seems like a nice lady, and she was doing her best. And she felt like she was very clear there. We've listened to our Black students, we've listened to our Black scholars, and actually, to be fair to them, Oxford and Cambridge have done a lot on access. Like, their student body is much more diverse than it used to be because they've been trying quite hard. But she thought, we also need some inspirational people in high places. And then they convinced themselves that this guy was a genius. I don't know. I suppose what do you respond, in that video, what do you see going wrong?
It's difficult to say, isn't it? Because of course, on an individual basis, I've no idea what's going on in that woman's mind. You know, let's believe that the best in her. There is sometimes this thing where I think like Black and brown people get hired to like more senior positions on the basis that they will play ball. Like they will be kind of non-threatening, or they won't appear to rock the boat too much as well. Do you know what I mean? And I think that happens with lots of different demographics, potentially, you know, where we can I don't know if it's like this Faustian pact almost of like, I will agree to be your kind of shiny representative, and in return, I won't rock the boat too much, you know, I'll play ball, and there'll be a kind of mutual transactional agreement. And maybe it's never like verbalized, but it's just kind of something that's there. So I don't know if that's also kind of part of it. Is like, well, we're not going to get someone who's really smart and who could seriously rock the boat on sociology, you know, and then ask some quite difficult questions actually of our department more broadly. We're going to get someone who would just kind of has a great story, will be great in the media, they'll play ball, they'll play the role, and maybe there wasn't any more questioning or curiosity there. That's the key thing, maybe, isn't it? Lack of curiosity there.
So you're thinking in the interview process, what was going through their heads wasn't, is this guy talented, but is this guy threatening to us? And if he's not threatening to us, then we want this famous Black guy.
Yeah, maybe not as crudely as that, but...
Well, they wouldn't have said it. These are nice, lovely people.
Yeah, and I wouldn't have said, like, they would have literally thought that in their head necessarily, but I think there perhaps might be an element of that. It's very difficult to know, and I think the letter did raise the idea of an investigation, right, which I think must happen.
They are going to have one.
You know, ultimately, there's still lots of stuff we just really don't know, so there should be an investigation further into this. But yeah, I mean, one of the things that was raised in that Guardian op-ed that I mentioned earlier by Jason, what was that he said there was a kind of institutional problem of a lack of curiosity, a lack of thought, and a lack of debate, actually, about what the hell these DEI initiatives are actually for. What's the purpose? What's the end goal? And I think that that debate internally within academia and lots of other places as well should be reignited. We should not be afraid of having that conversation. I think there's a fear about we're going to be giving meat to the right. We're going to be giving meat to these crazy ethno-nationalists, these so-called race realists or whatever, who are obsessed with this story for all the wrong reasons. But if we don't do that, we risk something much worse, I think, happening than where we are at the moment even.
Yeah, quite. This is a bit like that first story. On the first story, I'm sure we'll be coming back to this. And actually, I hope we won't, because that would mean there were more race riots. I kind of hope we won't be coming back to this story, maybe when the investigation is out. But this is already, one thing I feel bad for the guy about. I mean, I feel bad for the guy, a number of things. I'm not sure he doesn't.
Strikes me as vulnerable.
He strikes me as vulnerable,
yeah.
Which isn't a good reason that he should keep his job as a prestigious professor, but also why I think one can feel empathy for him in this position. But on the most sort of basic level, the thing I really feel sorry for him about is that this story happened in August. Because if this was in like May, and there was like loads of politics going on, Andy Burnham's just become Prime Minister, this would not be front page of the newspaper for a whole week. But it's because there's literally like not that much else for political journalists to talk about. This is just filling up so much space. On that note, let's go on to a more significant story. England's green and pleasant land has become a shade of browny yellow. July in the UK was the driest on record, with large parts of the south experiencing 0 millimetres of rain throughout the month. Images of Blackheath Common, usually verdant, but now looking positively parched, have been going viral. And the football fields of Hackney Marshes, where I walk my dog, now look more like the Nevada desert. Luckily, the trees have stayed green. Plant life does still exist in England. And we're not a desert. But many of the ponds have completely dried up. All of this makes climate change and the prospect of our future on a hotter planet less abstract and more real. But this extreme summer has come alongside a shrug of the shoulders from Britain's politicians. And we haven't heard much from them. Now, earlier this week, Zach Polanski attempted to change that. He demanded that Andy Burnham call an emergency Cobra meeting in response to the drought. Burnham hasn't answered that call. It's not just our government, though, who have responded to this extreme weather with relative quiet. In recent history, the UK has had an incredibly powerful climate protest movement. Extinction Rebellion, which became a global phenomenon for climate action, was founded in the UK. And between 2021 and 2024, Just Stop Oil seemed to be constantly in the news, first for blocking traffic and then for throwing soup on famous paintings. And they also disrupted other arts and cultural events. Of course, Extinction Rebellion has now largely wound up. Just Stop Oil stopped campaigning last year. They said that was to focus on sort of supporting activists either serving or facing jail time. And there haven't been any obvious new climate movements to take their place. Now, this is a reality. The writer Adrienne Buller has lamented this week in the New Statesman. The subtitle of the piece reads, "France, Spain and England are burning. Where is the climate movement to resist this catastrophe?" Now, I thought this was an interesting question, so I caught up with Adrienne Buller earlier today.
It's a strange movement for climate politics right now, a really weird time, because it feels as though there's in many ways this kind of incredibly fertile ground that you could build action out of. I mean, I think people are really seeing the escalating impacts of the climate crisis so vividly around them, whether that's, the quite sort of shocking imagery of these wildfires in France and Spain and the UK and elsewhere, but also in slightly more kind of mundane quotidian things that really affect sort of everyone on a very basic level, whether that's food and energy prices or, in the heat waves back in June, getting on our bus system where there's absolutely no air conditioning and it's, mostly ridden by the elderly and you can see them kind of wilting in 40-degree conditions, all these things. So there's all sorts of ways in which the material reality of climate feels more and more acute as time goes on. And yet we have less and less kind of visible climate politics, definitely a sort of absent climate movement relative to the kind of highs of 2019. And it's really sort of difficult to understand why that is. I have all sorts of speculations. And I think, some of the more obvious responses that have been offered, definitely which have merit, are, COVID initially kind of crushed what was a movement high in 2019 when it was sort of the school strikes, the Sunrise Movement, Extinction Rebellion in the UK. And nothing like that has been reconstituted. There's also probably a real sense of fatigue. I mean, when it comes to something like climate, the scale and complexity of this issue is so huge that you are just kind of like beating your head against a brick wall. And when it feels like you're achieving little, it's hard to kind of keep up that momentum. I mean, there's also obviously been a number of crises in the years since that have rightly captured both media attention, but also, the energy of movements, not least kind of the mass mobilization in response to genocide in Gaza. And so those are, I think, some more kind of direct, maybe more obvious reasons. But I think there's also kind of more subtle things going on in the background as well. There's been a real kind of like elite retrenchment on climate. And I mean that from the perspective of positions of power. Obviously, in the US, you have someone like Trump coming in and replacing the Biden administration. But in the UK, Reform, for example, have made attacking net zero a real kind of cornerstone of what they do. And in their sort of desperation to kind of corner Reform voters, both the Tories and Labour have at times kind of reflected that, whether that's in the Conservatives now attacking net zero or Labour kind of being a bit hush-hush about their action on climate, sort of refusing to lead on it. And on the media front, there's been a real decline, a sort of measurable decline in coverage of climate as an issue. And that does sort of impact public perception of how serious this is as a crisis. There's a study by the University of Colorado that found that since 2021, it's fallen by nearly 40% in terms of global news coverage. And that's a massive decline that, has implications. And I think as well, and then I'll stop. I mean, there's so many things we could diagnose, but there's been as well, I think, some very obvious attacks on press freedom, particularly in the US, but also civic freedoms in the UK, with things like, the Police Crime and Sentencing Bill, the Public Order Act, the treatment of protesters as terrorists under sentencing law. All of these things were direct responses to the sort of climate movement highs of 2019. Those bills were designed in response to that kind of activism, and they've been quite effective in sort of chilling it. So there are a lot of reasons, just to begin with there. And I think, there are some serious questions about what a climate movement that is reconstituted would actually and could actually look like at this point.
Some people do argue that the decline of a climate movement or the reduced politicization, let's say, of the climate is a good thing. So you quote in your article, the Searchlight Institute, which is a centrist think tank in the United States, and you quote them saying, the first rule about solving climate change is don't say climate change. And I think the argument there is probably twofold, which is if you're a centre-left party and you want to win an election, climate's not a sort of winning issue. But also if you're sort of a generalist climate activist, let's say, or someone who cares about the climate, then it's in your interest for this not to become a polarized issue. And the climate movement, obviously very left-coded, which might help sort of Reform or Trump or whoever make this into a political football issue. I take it you don't agree with Searchlight Institute, so sort of tell me why they're wrong.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think that there is a really understandable instinct at play there, right? Which is that the right has been incredibly effective at turning climate into a culture war issue. And we being progressive, centrist, people on the left, anyone in that kind of spectrum, we're sort of on the back foot in terms of responding to that very effective, I think, polarization of this issue. And so in some ways, I understand this instinct that they're sort of arguing. I don't know that even their own data sort of reflects that argument. And there's a really great essay in the Boston Review by someone called Aaron Regenberg that sort of dissects a lot of this work really well, which is that, there's this sense that because climate change might not be the number one immediate priority of certain voter groups, that it's somehow also does poorly at the ballot box. And I just don't think those two things are the same. And I think as well, it always calls to mind to me the probably overused Stuart Hall quote, but the quote that is, politics doesn't reflect majorities, it constructs them, right? And so if you don't treat climate change as a major political issue, you don't communicate it as intimately related to things like the cost of living, your grocery bills, your ability to insure your home, your energy bills, wars around the world and the volatility of the fossil fuel system, all of these things. If you fail to make those connections and you fail to state it as a political priority, it will recede as a political priority. You are ceding ground to parties of the right who wish to turn it into a culture war issue, who will use that vacuum to describe it, to deny it, and to set, the terms according to their agenda. And so, yeah, I don't think that that is a winning strategy. And, evidence from the US, Canada, UK, across Europe suggests that, like, even as public concern has fallen over the past couple of years, as reflected in, various polls, although, polls vary as much as they do, there's the vast majority of people still do care about this as a political issue. And it is a small minority that would be extra keen on a politician that opposes climate action. Those figures remain true. And I think failing to make climate a political issue and to be very strategic and effective in how we communicate it is a huge risk. And I don't think just backing off it as an issue is a great political strategy. And obviously it's a terrible strategy for, the planet and all of the life that lives on it.
All of the life matters, doesn't it?
All the life.
We don't want to lose all of the life. What difference would it make if there were a sort of strong climate movement now? And I suppose, importantly, what would be its demand? What sort of ideas, issues, potential solutions are we not hearing about? Because I suppose the climate movement is currently at a low ebb.
One thing that I've been thinking about is that probably a climate movement going forward will have to look quite different to how it felt and what it looked like in that kind of high period of 2019. And that's not to say we jettison all those kind of traditional protest techniques, but it feels increasingly that there are no easy kind of demands to be made when it comes to climate. Although it's still as important as ever that we get off fossil fuels, the state of the climate that we're in, how far off track we are, how extreme the impacts are becoming day on day, means that that kind of message, it feels really muddied, because we also need to be thinking really seriously about things like adaptation. We live now in an increasingly climate change world, and in the UK, but around the world, we live in societies and in infrastructural systems that are radically ill-equipped for that world. And so now we're in this kind of circumstance where that's happening, where climate is increasingly visibly connected to issues like global conflict. And so it becomes really hard to know exactly how you articulate a very clear demand. It's like we're against the climate crisis, but also creeping authoritarianism, and also war and genocide, and also we need to, and all of that kind of comes together in a very complicated way. And so I think something that provides a really fertile ground for action and that can kind of rebuild coalitions and communities behind and in support of climate action is actually in the realm of adaptation. And by that, I mean, the changes that we need to make to the way that we live, to the infrastructures, to how we organize our communities to respond to this different world that we now live in. A lot of that you can really sort of see, touch, and feel. A lot of it is very embedded in the community. Much of it relates to, the fight for better workplace conditions, whether that's, workers in the NHS where systems buckle under extreme heat, or whether it's, laborers working outdoors in construction in extreme heat conditions. There's all sorts of ways that adaptation links really intimately to things that people feel very strongly about, which they have strong emotional connections to, and which I think can bring in groups that might otherwise be excluded from, say, a mass protest movement behind a kind of new form of climate action. And I think because those actions, climate change has a real kind of scale problem, right? It feels so abstract, both from a temporal perspective, but also a geographical perspective. And these are the kind of actions that can really ground it and make it much more legible to whole different groups of people. So while I'm not sort of saying we shouldn't be hitting the streets and protesting anymore, I do think that we need to be evolving the strategies and tactics that we use.
In the piece in the New Statesman, you're critical of people sort of on the climate scene hyping progress on green tech, so particularly wind and solar rollout. Now, obviously, when I read that, I felt incredibly attacked. So explain your position. Yeah, I to be honest, actually, I'd be flattered if you were thinking of me. But anyway, explain your position there.
Yeah, so it's not that I don't think that we should celebrate wins when they happen, but it's that I think a lot of the celebration of the wins when it comes to sort of the incredible, like, eye-popping build-out of renewable energy that we've seen, largely driven by China, around the world. I think we need to be really clear-eyed about how and why that's happening and what it actually means from a climate perspective, which is kind of really the perspective that matters if what we're talking about is, the benefits of clean energy, although access is also a huge benefit there. But, there's a couple things at play there. One of which is that climate is not a problem that is solved just by building a ton of wind turbines and solar panels. That's a big part of it. It's definitely not all of it. And you can really see that in the fact that, that massive build out, impressive as it is, has yet to really make dents in the places that matter, which is sort of materially changing what the energy mix looks like. We still have an unprecedented amount of fossil fuels in the mix because aggregate global energy demand continues to rise. And as a result, we're also not really seeing dents in global emissions in the way that we absolutely need to see for that to really matter. And so while it is a positive story, I worry both about how it's celebrated in terms of prescription of causes. There's a lot of kind of like, oh, well, war has shown us that fossil fuels are volatile and made renewable energy a winner, and like, la-di-da, isn't that great? Ignoring, I think, a lot of other underlying trends and causes. But also, I think we need to be very careful about uncritically celebrating it as something that reflects progress on climate, because while there has been incredible progress in renewable energy, it has yet to translate into real meaningful impacts on cutting emissions. And so it's not that I don't think it's great, but I think that there's a much more sort of complicated picture when it comes to renewable build out.
That was Adrienne Buller speaking to me earlier today. My thank you to Banseka Kayembe for joining me throughout the show. And to you, all of you, have a great weekend. Enjoy the sun. Make the most of it. I know it's unhealthy. We've got this drought, but if you can find somewhere to lie near a body of water, I advise you to do so. We'll be back on Monday. Thank you for watching Novara Live. Good night.